Good afternoon and welcome to the first of 7 short webcasts on moving up to enterprise leadership, the 7 seismic shifts. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Michael Watkins. Michael, many thanks for being with us today.
Good to be here, Paul.
So Michael, we're going to be looking over the next 7 weeks at 7 seismic shifts. What do you mean by seismic shifts?
Sure. Well, I was doing some research basically on the most significant transitions that leaders go through in taking new roles. And one of the most challenging ones is when you move from being a functional leader to being a general manager or business unit leader or enterprise leader for the first time. And it was obvious that major things changed when that happened, but what wasn't as clear was what were the nature of those shifts. And so I engaged in a research project, more than 40 interviews with senior executives, looking at the nature of the transition that happens. And from this really came this notion of these 7 major shifts that leaders go through as they move from functional leadership to enterprise leadership.
So over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be looking at each of these shifts. The first one that you've identified is the need to move from specialist to generalist. Why is this so important?
Well, if you think about it, as you move up through the ranks, you're typically moving up through a functional silo. You may get some exposure to multiple functions, but suddenly when you become an enterprise leader for the first time, you're responsible for the full panoply of functions of the business. And you have people reporting to you that typically will know more about their functions than you do. And this can be a really major challenge when you start to manage people that really fundamentally are more knowledgeable about their parts of the business than you are.
Is it possible to manage people who know more about the business than you do?
It is if you adopt the right approach, right? I mean, the right approach is not to try and become an expert in those various areas, because that would be a 65-year developmental path, right? The right answer is to figure out, how do you get the best from that group of people? How do you hone the teamwork? How do you know enough about those functions to be sure that you're achieving the necessary integration? How do you be sure you've got the best people on your team representing each of those functions?
Is this what sometimes we hear people talking to as, or referring to as T-shaped leaders?
So not quite. The notion of T-shaped leaders basically says you're very deep in a function, but you have the ability to sort of talk to other functions or manage across other functions. This is really a skill set that's important for functional leaders on business teams, where they're there representing their function deeply, but also have to participate in business discussions. But really, as you become an enterprise leader, it's that cross-functional piece that becomes the most important. In general, you shouldn't be going down the T very often, or you're going to drive the person who's in that function, pretty crazy.
So how do you know if you need to move from specialist to generalist? How can you know that you've got enough generalist knowledge, that it's not just a kind of a broad nodding acquaintance, but how do you know when enough is enough?
So I think that it really boils down to understanding what you need to know about each of those functions. And the way I sort of think about it is there's sort of 3 big components to it. You need to be able to speak the language that people in each of those functions use, because you really need to be able to translate across the languages. So if someone's speaking finance, you need to be able to say, well, what you really mean from a business point of view is this. So that's part 1. Part 2 is understanding the sorts of mental models that people in those functions are bringing to the table. So a finance person is typically going to, approach the world through the lens of costs and benefits, discounted cash flow. There's a set of points of view that a functional leader is going to bring to the table. A sales and marketing person, it could be customer segmentation, value proposition. But you need to understand those fundamental mindsets. And the third thing is I need to know enough about you, if you're my, let's say, finance VP, to know whether you're good or not, right? What's the questions that I ask? What are the metrics that I look at? How am I going to really discern whether I've got an okay finance person, a really lousy finance person, or someone like you who's absolutely terrific?
Oh, that's great to know, Michael. So you mentioned before that, if you really wanted to know everything in a deep way, it would be a 65-year developmental process, which, obviously not many people have got time to do that. What's the best way of moving from specialist to generalist? How can you get up to speed?
Sure. So the truth is that in the end, there's, nothing fully prepares you for becoming an enterprise leader for the first time with the full set of functions. That said, there's lots you can do to prepare yourself. One piece of it is obviously spending time in other functions if that's possible. Generally, that's pretty challenging because typically the career paths move in the silos, and it can be a somewhat risky thing to move outside your function. That said, if you have the opportunity and if there's an understanding that there'll be a re-entry path, that can be a tremendous thing to do, especially functions that are not adjacent to yours, if you can really get some different experience. The other primary way is through participation in cross-functional teams. Those can be either project-based, it could be new product development teams, I think are a fantastic place because typically lots comes together. Teams that are overseeing major investments, teams that are overseeing acquisition integration. And these are places where you really see the kind of crucible of the functions coming together in a powerful way.
And do you need to be a particular kind of leader? Do you need to be very open-minded? Do you need to be very curious? Are there particular skill sets, people watching today saying, is this me? Are there particular skills you need?
So I think the answer is yes. And I think that if you find that you absolutely love doing the deep work of your function, right? And you sort of live and breathe to do marketing, and that's absolutely what you love to do, then you're probably well advised to kind of stick with that and build a career inside the function. And there are tremendous careers to be built, right, in functional leadership. They're very important in organizations. If you're more sort of focused on the broader set of business interests, if you sort of like to focus on the external environment a lot, if you're kind of a marketing person but you're fascinated by what goes on in a plant, that's kind of a good indication that that sort of cross-functional set of interests is relevant for you, and you probably should pursue it. But underneath it all is really the learning orientation that you mentioned. I mean, and this is generally true of transitions, right? The biggest reasons why leaders fail in transition is because they don't go back into a learning mode, right? And so, but it's even more crucial when you're making this major shift to enterprise leadership.
Michael, thanks so much for being with us today. I know that you're looking at these 7 seismic shifts in IMD's PD program, the Program for Executive Development. We're also running this series of webcasts, and you're going to join us again next week for the second of the 7 shifts.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.